The air inside the car was stale, thick with the scent of leather and a lie. Clara sat with her hands gripping the steering wheel, her fingers in nervous, staccato rhythm against the cool plastic. Outside, the neon sign of the cafe, the Daily Grind, cast a lurid, buzzing glow against the deepening twilight. It was a place deliberately chosen for its anonymity, a nondescript establishment on the frayed edge of the city, far from the manicured lawns and watchful eyes of her suburban life. Tonight, Daniel was preoccupied. A late-night strategy meeting, he'd said over dinner, his voice full of the earnest dedication she both admired and, if she were honest with herself, resented. His preoccupation was her opportunity. A small window in the carefully constructed edifice of their life, through which she could slip out, unnoticed, and breathe a different kind of air. An air thick with possibility and the thrill of the unknown. She called it her diversion. It was a clinical, detached word, one of many she used to build a soundproof wall between her actions and her conscience. To anyone looking in, Clara's life was a masterpiece of domestic artistry. She was the epitome of the loving, dedicated wife. Their home was her canvas, and she was a meticulous painter. The house was always immaculate, the scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers a constant. Daniel's favorite meals appeared on the table as if by magic. Their social calendar was managed with the precision of a military campaign. She was the silent, efficient engine that kept their shared world running smoothly. She loved Daniel. That was the central, unshakable truth, the load-bearing wall of her entire justification. She loved him with a deep, quiet reverence. Their 2 decades of marriage were a gallery of happy moments. The clumsy, rain-soaked first kiss under a university archway, the shared terror and triumph of buying their first home. The warmth of his hand in hers as they watched their children, Emily and Ben, take their first steps. He was a good man, a solid man, an anchor in the turbulent seas of life. But anchors, by their very nature, are meant to hold you in one place. And beneath the placid surface of her life, Clara felt a void. A deep, gnawing emptiness she could neither explain nor ignore. It wasn't that Daniel had done anything wrong. In fact, his unwavering goodness was part of the problem. He was a pillar of stability, a monument to predictability. As the years had passed, their relationship had settled into a comfortable, well-worn groove. Their conversations, once vibrant explorations of dreams and ideas, now revolved around logistics. The mortgage, the kids' tuition, the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. The spark, that wild, brilliant fire of their youth, had faded to a low, steady ember. And while Daniel seemed content to warm his hands by its gentle glow, Clara found herself shivering in the cold, yearning for a bonfire. So, she had created her rules. A personal moral code designed to contain the wildfire, to allow her to play with matches without burning the whole house down. Rule number 1. Never meet the same person twice. Emotional attachment was the line she would not cross. These were transactions, not relationships. Encounters, not affairs. Rule number 2. It is strictly physical. Her love, her heart, her loyalty, those were reserved for Daniel. They were the crown jewels, locked safely in the vault of their marriage. What she did in these anonymous cafes and dimly lit hotel rooms was a separate currency, a foreign coin that had no value in her real life. Rule number 3, the most important of all, never let it interfere. Her responsibilities at home were sacrosanct. She would drop everything, cancel any meeting, if Daniel or the children needed her. Her double life was a ghost, a phantom that existed only in the shadows, never allowed to touch the sunlit world of her family. Her methods were meticulous. She used public library computers to browse the discreet classified ads, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She never posted an ad herself, too risky. She had a separate, anonymous email address, a fake name, a practice story. Every interaction was a carefully choreographed dance of deception. Yet, despite the rules and precautions, there was always the fear. A low-grade, constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface. As Clara sat in her car, the engine ticking as it cooled, she couldn't shake the unease. The thought of being discovered was a physical terror. Not for what it would do to her reputation, but for what it would do to Daniel. She couldn't bear to imagine the look on his face, the shattering of his steadfast belief in her. The realization that the woman he adored, the woman he trusted implicitly, had betrayed him in such a fundamental way. For all her justifications, she knew her actions were selfish. But in the twisted logic of her secret heart, she framed these encounters as an act of marital preservation. By seeking the thrill of the new elsewhere, she could return to the safety of the old, more fulfilled, more present, more able to be the wife Daniel believed her to be. It was a beautiful, intricate, and deeply flawed narrative, and it was starting to crumble. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She forced a smile onto her face, a mask she had grown adept at wearing. Tonight would be no different. Just one more meeting. One more escape. She had no idea that this night, the carefully balanced architecture of her life was about to be subjected to a wrecking ball. Daniel glanced at his watch. 7:15 p.m. He took a slow sip of his beer, the cold glass a solid, reassuring weight in his hand. He was sitting at the bar of a casual, noisy restaurant Ethan had chosen, a place called The Junction. It was the kind of place with exposed brick walls and an overly ambitious cocktail menu. Ethan had begged him to come. Moral support, man, he'd pleaded earlier that week, his voice a mixture of excitement and raw panic. I'm meeting someone from one of those apps. What if she looks nothing like her pictures? What if I run out of things to say? Daniel, always willing to play the part of the supportive older brother, had agreed. He didn't quite understand the complexities of modern dating, the anxious world of swipes and algorithms. His own love story felt like an artifact from a different era, a simple, analog tale in a digital world. He and Clara had just met in a library. They'd talked, they'd laughed, and that was that. He scanned the room, a faint, fond smile on his face. He spotted Ethan at a small corner table, his posture as rigid as a board, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. The kid reminded Daniel of his younger self, all hopeful optimism and clumsy earnestness. Daniel loved being a mentor at the office. He loved sharing his experience, not just in business, but in life. He often found himself talking about Clara, sharing stories of their early days, the life they had built together. He considered himself the luckiest man in the world to have found someone so loyal, so supportive, so completely and utterly his. He was a pillar of stability, and she was his foundation. The front door of the restaurant chimed, and Daniel glanced toward the entrance, expecting to see Ethan's mystery date. His smile froze. His blood ran cold. The beer glass nearly slipped from his numb fingers. There, standing in the doorway, bathed in the soft, welcoming light of the restaurant, was Clara. His Clara. His wife, who was supposed to be at her book club meeting across town. She was wearing a fitted blue dress he recognized, the one he bought her for their anniversary last year. Her hair was down, styled in a way she only bothered with for special occasions. She was here, in a place she shouldn't be, looking around with the same nervous, hopeful anticipation he had just seen on Ethan's face. His mind scrambled, a frantic search for a logical explanation. A flaw in the data. Asterisk, she's meeting a friend. A work colleague. It's a coincidence. Asterisk. But as he watched her scan the room, her gaze sweeping past him at the bar without a flicker of recognition, every denial crumbled to dust. Her eyes landed on Ethan's table, and she smiled. A wide, brilliant, genuine smile. The kind of smile he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The truth slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, the world tilting on its axis. He watched, a helpless, paralyzed spectator, as she walked over to Ethan's table. She leaned in to greet him, her movements fluid, familiar, confirming the absolute worst of his unspoken fears. His heart began to pound a heavy, sickening rhythm against his ribs. His first instinct was to stand up, to storm over there, to demand an explanation, to make a scene. But something held him back. A toxic cocktail of shock, disbelief, and a profound, gut-wrenching sense of humiliation. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. He was frozen, a statue at the bar, watching a surreal, nightmare play unfold before him. Ethan, completely oblivious, was clearly smitten. He stood up, pulled out her chair, his face a mask of boyish charm. Daniel watched them talk, their voices a low, indecipherable hum. He saw Clara laugh at something Ethan said, a light, carefree sound that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes before his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Ethan. She's older than I expected, but she seems really nice. Should I stay? Asterisk. Daniel stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill. His hands were shaking. He took a deep, ragged breath, fighting for control. He couldn't let Ethan become collateral damage in this disaster. The kid was innocent. He was a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. With trembling fingers, he typed back. Yes. Have a conversation. Gain confidence. I'll stay for a bit longer. Asterisk. He needed time. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. He watched them for a few more minutes, his emotions swinging wildly between a white-hot, volcanic rage and a deep, aching sorrow. When Clara excused herself to use the restroom, Daniel seized his chance. He couldn't bear to see another second of it. He tossed a few bills onto the counter, more than enough to cover his beer, and slipped out of the restaurant, a ghost leaving the scene of his own murder. He sat in his car, the familiar leather interior of his Mustang feeling alien, unsafe. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't go home. Not yet. The thought of seeing her later, of her asking about his day, of having to pretend that everything was normal, made him feel physically ill. He drove aimlessly, the powerful hum of the engine drowned out by the storm raging in his mind. Asterisk how long? How many times? Why? Asterisk. He thought they were happy. Or, at least, content. He had loved her with everything he had. He had built his life around her. He had trusted her implicitly. And she had taken that trust and shattered it into a million pieces on the floor of a cheap restaurant, with his own protege as the unwitting hammer. By the time he finally returned home, the house was dark and silent. Clara's car was in the driveway, a mocking testament to her double life. He sat in his own car for a long time, just staring at the house, at the dark windows that looked like dead eyes. Finally, he summoned the courage to go inside. As he lay in bed that night, feigning sleep when she slipped in beside him, her scent filling the air, Daniel's mind churned. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed a plan. Confronting her now, in the heat of his pain and rage, would only lead to more chaos, more lies. He needed to be cold, methodical. He needed to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. Little did Clara know, the carefully constructed world she had built, with its rules and its secrets, was about to come crashing down. And he, her steadfast, predictable husband, was going to be the one to light the fuse. The next morning felt like waking up in a stranger's house. The light filtering through the bedroom window was the same, the scent of brewing coffee was the same, but everything was different. The woman lying beside him, the woman who had been the source of his comfort for 2 decades, was now the source of a profound and terrifying uncertainty. Clara moved through her morning routine with the practiced, effortless grace he had always admired. She hummed softly as she packed the kids' lunches for their day trips. They were older now, college-aged, but she still treated them with a maternal fussiness when they were home on break. She straightened the throw pillows on the couch. She moved through the spaces of their shared life as if nothing had changed. To Daniel, it was a grotesque parody. Every normal gesture felt like a performance, every smile a lie. When she leaned in to kiss him goodbye before heading out for her volunteer work, he forced himself to return the gesture. It was a hollow, mechanical act, his lips brushing against hers with a revulsion he had to fight to conceal. The moment the door closed behind her, he slumped into a chair at the dining table, the facade of normalcy crumbling. His mind was a maelstrom. How had they come to this? He had always believed their marriage was a fortress, built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. He knew the initial, fiery passion of youth had cooled over the years, settling into something quieter, more stable. But wasn't that normal? Wasn't that the comfortable, predictable rhythm of a long and successful partnership? He had never once doubted her love. He had never questioned her loyalty. Now, those certainties were shattered, and the questions that remained were a special kind of torture. How long had this been going on? Was Ethan the first, or just the latest in a long line of anonymous men? Did she feel anything for them, or was it purely physical? And the most painful question of all, the one that twisted in his gut like a shard of glass, did she still love him? Or was he just a comfortable habit, a convenient backdrop for her secret life? He wanted answers, but he knew confronting her now would be a mistake. She would lie. She would deny. She would turn it back on him, somehow. He needed more than a single, shocking event. He needed a case. He needed evidence. He thought about calling a private investigator, but the idea felt too sordid, too much like something out of a cheap detective novel. He needed someone he could trust completely, someone who was discreet and intelligent. His thoughts turned to Sophia. His assistant at work, Sophia was more than just an employee. Over the years, she had become a confidant, a trusted sounding board. She was fiercely loyal, whip-smart, and had an uncanny ability to see through nonsense. He hesitated. Was it appropriate to bring such a deeply personal, painful issue to a professional relationship? But the weight of it was too much to bear alone. Later that day, he called her into his office and closed the door. "I need your help, Sophia," he began, his voice heavy. "And this stays between us. No one else can know. Sophia nodded, her expression serious, her intelligent eyes full of concern. Of course, Daniel. You can trust me. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Saying it aloud would make it irrevocably real. I think Clara is cheating on me, he finally said, the words tumbling out in a raw, painful rush. Sophia's eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. Are you sure? She asked gently. He recounted the events of the previous night, his voice trembling as he described seeing Clara with Ethan. Sophia listened intently, her expression shifting from empathy to a quiet, controlled anger on his behalf. When he finished, she leaned forward. Daniel, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I can't imagine how hard this must be. I don't know what to do, Sophia, he admitted, his voice cracking. I can't just confront her without knowing the whole truth. But I don't even know where to start. Sophia was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. If you're not ready to talk to her, she said, her voice calm and logical, then maybe you should gather more information first. See if this is a pattern. That way, you'll have a clearer picture of what's really going on before you decide your next steps. It made sense. It was a cold, methodical approach, but his emotions were too chaotic to be trusted. He needed data. He needed facts. He had to approach the demolition of his marriage with the same precision he would bring to a new building project. The first step was the most invasive. That night, after Clara was asleep, he went to her office. Her laptop was on the desk, humming softly. He felt a profound sense of guilt as he opened it, but the memory of her smiling at Ethan pushed him forward. He found her browser history. It was a roadmap of her secret life. Classified sites. Anonymous messaging boards. He felt sick to his stomach. Then he found the emails. A separate, hidden account under a false name. It was a treasure trove of her betrayal. Dozens of conversations with different men, all with the same clinical, detached tone. Arrangements for meetings at anonymous cafes. Brief, impersonal pleasantries. It was a cold, efficient system. But one thread of emails stood out. They were with a man named Mark. The tone was different. Warmer. More personal. They had met more than once. They spoke of shared interests, of a connection. She had broken her own primary rule. He printed everything. Every email. Every chat log. He placed the stack of papers in a folder, a dossier of his wife's infidelity. As he closed the folder, a new, chilling resolve settled over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the lies she had built her life upon. And he was going to tear it all down. Clara sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the perfectly trimmed hedges in their backyard. She had spent hours on those hedges, crafting them into a neat, orderly green wall. A barrier against the chaos of the outside world. But the chaos was no longer outside. It was inside. It had been a week since her meeting with Ethan, a week since that strange, unsettling encounter. And a week since Daniel's behavior had shifted from predictably distant to something else entirely. A watchful stillness. A cold, unnerving calm. He still smiled when she spoke. He still kissed her goodbye. But it was a performance. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cool, analytical glint she couldn't decipher. Their conversations had become stilted, polite exchanges about schedules and household chores, each word carefully chosen, as if he were navigating a minefield. She found herself replaying the night with Ethan over and over. He had been charming, attentive, but something had felt off. She had felt guilty. A genuine pang of guilt, not just the low-grade fear of being caught. It was a new, unwelcome emotion in her carefully compartmentalized life. Her rules, the ones she had so religiously followed, were beginning to feel like flimsy, porous things. She had always told herself that these excursions were a way to keep her marriage alive. That by indulging in the thrill of the forbidden, she could return home a better, more present, more engaged wife. It was a fragile, self-serving justification, but it had worked. Until now. Now, her actions felt less like a harmless diversion and more like a ticking time bomb. She thought of Daniel, the man who had given her his unwavering love and loyalty for 20 years. The man she, in her own flawed, complicated way, still loved. The thought of losing him, of him discovering the full extent of her deception, was a physical pain. She had to fix this. She had to bridge the growing chasm between them. She started with small gestures. A candlelit dinner. A handwritten note tucked into his briefcase. Wearing the perfume she knew he loved. Daniel smiled, he thanked her, but his responses felt rehearsed. Determined, she pushed further. She suggested a weekend trip to a cozy cabin in the mountains, a place they hadn't visited since their early, care for years. It'll be like old times, she'd said, her voice laced with a hopeful optimism she didn't quite feel. He hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, his expression unreadable. The drive to the cabin was a study in strained silence. Clara did most of the talking, filling the space with bright, cheerful anecdotes, stories of their past, hoping to coax him out of his shell. But he remained distant, a passenger in a car full of shared memories he seemed unwilling to revisit. At the cabin, she went all out. She cooked his favorite meals. She brought out old photo albums. She tried to initiate the easy, comfortable intimacy they had once shared. But each attempt was met with the same polite, reserved demeanor. He was a fortress, and she no longer had the key. One evening, as they sat by the crackling fire, she finally had to ask. "Daniel," she began, her voice soft. "Is something wrong?" He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. "Why do you ask?" "You've been distant," she said carefully. "I feel like something's bothering you. Did I do something wrong?" He turned to look at her then, and for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of raw, unfiltered pain in his eyes before he quickly masked it. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Just busy. Work's been stressful." She nodded, though she didn't believe him for a second. The wall between them was higher and thicker than ever. That night, as she lay beside his still, rigid body, Clara stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. What if he knew? The thought was unbearable. She had been so careful. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the cracks in her facade were finally starting to show. The carefully constructed world she had built was beginning to feel like a house of cards in a hurricane, and she was terrified of the coming storm. The Thanksgiving invitation was a strategic opportunity. Clara's parents hosted the holiday every year, a grand, traditional affair. It was the perfect stage. In the weeks leading up to it, Daniel had continued his cold, methodical investigation. The folder of evidence grew thicker. He had hired a discreet PI, a former police officer Sophia had recommended, to do a background check on Mark, the man from the emails. The PI discovered his real name was Michael, a married financial advisor with 2 kids and a history of infidelity. The classic suburban predator. Daniel's plan was simple, yet brutal. He was going to introduce a new variable into Clara's carefully controlled world. He was going to bring Sophia. He invited her under the guise of kindness. "My assistant, Sophia, doesn't have any family nearby," he told Clara casually a few days before the holiday. "I thought it would be nice to invite her to join us for dinner." Clara, caught off guard, could hardly refuse without seeming cold and inhospitable. "Of course," she'd said, her smile a little too bright, a little too tight. When they arrived at her parents' house, the scene was exactly as Daniel had anticipated. Clara, in a desperate attempt to play the part of the perfect wife and hostess, was flustered. And the sight of him with Sophia, who was warm, poised, and effortlessly charming, clearly threw her completely off balance. Clara's mother, bless her heart, welcomed Sophia warmly. Her sister, Ellen, was a little more suspicious, her eyes darting between Daniel, Clara, and Sophia. Her father was glued to the football game, oblivious. Throughout the dinner, Daniel played his part. He was the attentive host, the charming son-in-law. But he directed most of his warmth and attention toward Sophia. He laughed at her jokes. He complimented her insights on a recent news story. He treated her not as an assistant, but as an equal, a respected friend. He watched Clara out of the corner of his eye. Her composure was cracking. Her smile was a brittle, painted-on thing. Her hands trembled as she clutched her wine glass. Finally, as dessert was being served, she broke. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking as she stood up. "Can I speak to you for a moment? In private?" He followed her into the kitchen. The moment they were alone, her facade crumbled. "What is she doing here?" she hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper. "She's my guest," Daniel replied evenly. "And she's been nothing but polite. Unlike you. Don't you dare turn this on me." Clara's anger flared. "You brought another woman to my family's Thanksgiving." Daniel's eyes narrowed. The moment had come. "Humiliating," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, dangerous calm. "You want to talk about humiliation, Clara? Let's talk about the junction. Let's talk about Ethan." Clara's heart dropped. Her face went white. What are you talking about?" she stammered, but her eyes gave her away. "I know, Clara," Daniel said, leaning in, his voice a quiet venom. "I know everything. About Ethan. About Michael. About the emails, the secret account, the lies." He watched the dawning horror spread across her face. "You've had your fun. But it's over. I'm done. Before she could respond, a crash from the dining room shattered the moment. They rushed back in to find chaos. One of Ellen's toddlers had knocked over a wine glass, and Sophia, startled, had dropped the pumpkin pie. Amidst the commotion, Daniel caught Sophia's eye. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A look of quiet confidence. She wasn't going anywhere. The rest of the evening was a blur of strained politeness. Clara was a ghost at her own family gathering. By the time he and Sophia left, Daniel knew he had won the battle. Clara's carefully constructed world was in ruins. She had underestimated him. She had mistaken his quiet stability for weakness. And now, she was going to face the consequences. The war, however, was just beginning. The days following Thanksgiving were a descent into a private hell. Daniel's words replayed in her mind on a relentless loop. I know everything. The foundation of her life, the one she thought she had so cleverly reinforced with lies and justifications, had been revealed to be nothing but sand. He knew. He had known all along. His distance, his coldness, it hadn't been work stress. It had been the quiet, patient observation of a man gathering evidence. Clara clung to the desperate belief that she could still fix it. She called him, texted him, emailed him. Her messages were a frantic torrent of apologies, explanations, and pleas. She would do anything, change anything, if he would just talk to her. He remained silent. A wall of impenetrable, unforgiving silence. Then the letter arrived. Not from him, but from his lawyer. It was a cold, clinical document outlining the terms of their separation and his intent to file for divorce. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had made mistakes, yes, but their marriage, their 2 decades of shared history, had to be strong enough to withstand this. She wouldn't let him just walk away. She hired her own lawyer, a bulldog of a man, and instructed him to fight, to contest everything, to drag the proceedings out. If she couldn't have Daniel back, she would make sure his departure was as painful and costly as possible. The legal battle became a war of attrition. She demanded the house, the vacation property, a punitive amount of spousal support. It wasn't about the money. It was about control, about power. It was about making him feel a fraction of the helplessness she was feeling. But she had underestimated Daniel's resolve. He met every demand with a calm, unyielding determination. The quiet, predictable man she had married was gone, replaced by a cold, strategic stranger. Her personal life began to unravel. Friends took sides. Invitations dwindled. She was a pariah, the subject of hushed, pitying whispers. Her work suffered. She was distracted, unfocused, her once sharp mind clouded by a fog of grief and rage. Loneliness became her only constant companion. The anonymous men she had once sought for a thrill now seemed pathetic and meaningless. She was adrift, her carefully constructed world in ruins, and she had no one to blame but herself. One night, in a fit of desperation and self-loathing, she went back online. She created a new profile, a new identity, and sought the only thing she thought could numb the pain, the fleeting validation of a stranger's attention. She connected with a man whose messages were charming, his compliments a soothing balm on her raw, wounded ego. He suggested they meet. A discreet motel on the edge of town. Clara knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she was desperate. She agreed. She didn't know that the man she was meeting was not who he claimed to be. She didn't know he had a history of targeting vulnerable, lonely women. She didn't know that her final, desperate act of escape would lead her not to comfort, but to a tragic, violent end. The phone call from the police came on a cold, gray morning. The words were clinical, detached. Clara had been found in a motel room. There had been an altercation. She was gone. Daniel listened, his mind a numb, static-filled void. It was surreal. He had been preparing for a war in a courtroom, not for a funeral. Despite the anger, despite the betrayal, he had never wished her harm. The thought of her being gone forever was an emotional impossibility he couldn't process. Sophia was with him when he got the call. She drove him to the police station, her hand a steady, reassuring presence on his arm. She sat with him as he listened to the grim, sordid details of Clara's final hours. A man she'd met online. A predator. A violent end to a life of quiet desperation. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief, confusion, and guilt. He was Clara's husband, her next of kin. He had to handle the arrangements, the estate, the endless mountain of paperwork. He moved through it all like an automaton, his emotions locked away behind a wall of numb disbelief. Friends and family offered their condolences, but their eyes were full of a morbid curiosity and unspoken judgment. He was the wronged husband, a figure of pity and fascination. Sophia remained his anchor. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't press him to talk. She just was there. She cooked him meals he didn't have the appetite to eat. She handled his calls. She sat with him in the evenings, in a comfortable silence that was more healing than any words could be. One night, the dam finally broke. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted, his voice raw. "I'm angry at her, but I'm sad that she's gone. And I feel guilty. If I hadn't pushed her away." "This is not your fault, Daniel," Sophia said, her voice firm but gentle. "Her choices were her own. You were allowed to feel everything. The anger, the sadness, the relief. It's all part of it." He allowed himself to cry then, the tears a hot, cleansing release. In the months that followed, Daniel began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. He sold the house, a place now haunted by too many ghosts. Sophia helped him find a new apartment, a modern, light-filled space that felt like a fresh start. Their relationship, born of crisis and forged in grief, began to evolve. It was slow, tentative. They started spending time together outside of work. She introduced him to her world of art galleries and jazz clubs, coaxing him out of the shell he had built around himself. Their first kiss was quiet, unplanned, and felt more right than anything had in a very long time. "It's okay," she whispered afterward, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "You're allowed to be happy, Daniel." And slowly, he began to believe her. By the time the holidays rolled around, they were a couple. The Thanksgiving they hosted in his new apartment was a world away from the chaos of the previous year. It was small, intimate, filled with a quiet, genuine warmth. Clara's death would always be a tragic, painful chapter in his life, but it was no longer the defining one. With Sophia, he had found a new partner, a new foundation, a woman who had seen him at his absolute worst and had loved him anyway. As they stood together at the sink that night, washing the last of the dishes, Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Yeah," he said, his voice full of a quiet, certain peace. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." The reconstruction of Daniel's life was not a simple, linear process. The fallout from Clara's betrayal and death had sent shockwaves through their extended family, and navigating the emotional debris was a delicate, ongoing task. Daniel's parents, though supportive, struggled to reconcile their image of Clara with the truth of her secret life. His mother, a woman who believed in the sanctity of marriage above all else, would often say she was flawed, but she didn't deserve that end, her tone a complex mixture of pity and quiet condemnation. Her initial relationship with Sophia was cautious, but Sophia's steady, unassuming kindness eventually won her over. Daniel's sister, Caroline, was a more difficult case. She had been close to Clara, and she couldn't easily let go of the idealized version of her sister-in-law she had held for so long. At family gatherings, her grief often manifested as subtle, cutting remarks directed at the new dynamic. "It's just surprising," she'd remarked at Thanksgiving, her voice sweet but sharp, "how quickly some people can move on." Sophia, ever composed, had simply smiled. "Healing is different for everyone," she'd replied, her calm diffusing the tension. The most complex relationship was with his children. His son, Ben, who was away at college, seemed to process the news with a stoic, detached pragmatism that mirrored Daniel's own. But his daughter, Emily, had been closer to her mother. The revelation of Clara's infidelity had shaken her, but her mother's tragic death had plunged her into a confusing maelstrom of anger and grief. She was polite to Sophia, but there was a cold, protective wall around her. She watched her father's new relationship with a quiet, suspicious disapproval. It wasn't that she disliked Sophia, it was that accepting her felt like a betrayal of her mother's memory. Daniel understood this. He made a conscious effort to spend one-on-one time with Emily, to give her the space to grieve in her own way. He didn't push Sophia on her. "She's grieving too," Sophia had said to him. "You can't rush her process." And so, they moved forward, a new, blended, and broken family, navigating the complicated aftermath of a life that had been built on a foundation of secrets. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, Daniel felt he had the right partner, and the right blueprints, to build something that would last.